Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindsay Jennings. I'm the Director of Development for the Institute for Humane Studies, and I am delighted to welcome you today. Please note that we are recording this webinar to share with those who were unable to attend. I would like to thank all our supporters who have joined. Without you, we would not be able to fulfill our mission, which is the achievement of a freer society by discovering and investing in talented students, scholars, and other intellectual entrepreneurs who are advancing the principles and practices of freedom. The Institute for Humane Studies is building an academic network of high-impact scholars and research communities that span generational, disciplinary, ideological, and professional divides to develop and advance the ideas that support thriving, free societies and widespread human flourishing. At IHS, we believe that diverse viewpoints and the exchange of ideas are essential to a free and open society. We believe that fresh thinking and civil discourse are needed now more than ever. They matter in the academy, in public policy, and to each person on this call today, which is why I'm pleased to present our second in a series of crucial conversations. This series aims to bring you some of the best and brightest minds in their fields, applying their knowledge and research to solve today's most pressing problems. Last time, we dove into housing and how that impacts a free society with Ed Glazier. Today, we will explore the vital role of corporate governance in shaping the future of a free society. In this rich discussion, you will discover that corporate governance is not just about the rules and practices of a company. It is also about the ecosystem of individuals who interact with it. I'm thrilled to introduce you to my colleague, Jean Hoffman, Director of Coalitions, who will introduce you to our esteemed speaker, Siri Terjesen. Jean.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. And I'm really excited to introduce Siri because her work goes beyond the world of the academy. So her students become the future business leaders and entrepreneurs of the United States, but she also advises businesses, administrative bodies, and other people on the impact of different policies and what they'll do for our businesses. So it's great to have her here. She's Associate Dean, Research and External Relations, founding Executive Director of the Madden Center for Value Creation, and Professor of Entrepreneurship at Florida Atlantic University. And her research is among the world's top 2% most cited scholars, which is very impressive. Dr. Terjesen is associate editor of 5 leading journals, including Academy of Management Perspectives and Small Business Economics. She's also editorial board review member of 6 other journals. She's received outstanding teacher awards at the undergraduate, graduate, and executive education levels. And she was a 2023 recipient of the Institute for Humane Studies Distinguished Scholar Award. So welcome, Siri. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Lindsay, Jean, Emily, Oakley, the entire IHS team. As professors, I just want to say we couldn't do this without you. All the ideas that are so fundamental for IHS are so fundamental for us as faculty. And we thank you so much for your support. It's so exciting to be here today with you.
Thank you, Siri. And could you go just like very briefly into the work that you're doing at the center?
So I'm here. I can't show you outside because it's too sunny. I'm here at Florida Atlantic University College of Business. We're actually the 12th largest accredited college of business in America, with over 9,000 students in the business school and about 30,000 students at the university. And I'm very, very fortunate to run the Madden Center for Value Creation, where we take all of these ideas extremely seriously. And for us, at the core of creating value is corporate governance.
And speaking of creating value, you're the Center for Value Creation. And before, you and I were talking about that term, and I really like the way it frames things. So I was wondering if you could go into a little more detail, like what is value creation?
Sure. Well, we're guided by Bart Madden's book, Value Creation Principles, and he just has a brand new biographical work that talks about his journey. But for us, really, it's about promoting value creation as the foundational guiding principle, creating an educational platform. So we actually have a free course that anyone can enroll in anywhere in the world on value creation. And we put together materials. We actually ran doctoral student training here 2 weeks ago and flew in doctoral students from all over actually the world, 12 from America, 3 from outside. And then our third piece of this is really focusing academic research on the firm as the fundamental unit of analysis. And this research is completely up that alley. And it's,
Great.
we could talk about that later, but I've actually been doing research aligned to this since I became a doctoral student 25 years ago.
And for things like value creation, like what sort of role does corporate governance play? Like how is that related to businesses and the outcome from businesses?
So what is this corporate governance thing? And lots of folks want to define it variously. I think we could all agree on a general definition that these are the rules, the practices, the processes by which a company is directed and controlled. And so that encompasses everything from the action plans, internal controls, performance management, corporate disclosure. But then the disagreement piece would be to advance shareholder aims only or to advance a much broader pool of stakeholders.
Great. And speaking of shareholders, stakeholders, so I know Milton Friedman talked about this in the 70s. What is shareholder theory? How is it related to corporate governance? And is it still relevant in today's world?
That's fun because I have to date myself. I was born in 1975. So this Friedman's essay came out in 1970, but earlier today at the business school, we had Leon Cooperman speak to us. And actually one of the first things he said straight out of the gate was talking about Milton Friedman's essay, because for those of us who subscribe to this, shareholders are the backbone of the entity. We must respect their interests at all levels. And this was, as so many of you know, a 1970 New York Times piece that said the entity's greatest responsibility lies in satisfying shareholders. Interestingly, though, it spurred a lot of response to it. And that's where we got some of the backlash that we see today. But Friedman, this is a doctrine of shareholder theory. Certainly the 1970 piece was the most famous, but there were books and other articles published. And it's really about how shareholders should be in charge of those key decisions.
And in contrast to shareholder theory, we're hearing more often stakeholder theory, where you take the considerations of other people into play. Could you talk more about that, how it might come at odds with the corporation's health itself, and how we're seeing that manifest today?
Mm-hmm. And boy, we've seen it, I think, since right after that essay was published and a little before, but got a lot of traction. First from academics. Ed Freeman was at UVA, and he was really famous for advancing stakeholder theory, by which everyone is a stakeholder and should have a say. And the best way to describe this is before, all of those folks certainly had a say, but it went through the prism of shareholder value and then into the firm. And Ed Freeman and others, most famously also Klaus Schwab, who started something called the World Economic Forum, they basically pushed this very, very, very hard. And we can talk about all the different ways that it's manifesting itself, but certainly in how business schools teach. We here at FAU, we're very lucky that we can teach market-based principles, but there are an awful lot of places that have switched to more of a stakeholder model. And basically that's whoever thinks they have a stake has a stake. My favorite example of this is teaching. So we would plot all of those stakeholders on like a 2x2, and we would talk about the extent to which their stake was real and the extent to which there would be impact from their stake. And then we talk about, okay, well, who really are the stakeholders? It's the shareholders who can vote. But this stakeholder piece just broadens it to so many individuals, many of whom were already being considered, but just through the prism of shareholder value.
And you were telling me a few examples before of some ways this has manifested in corporations, where corporations have acted against their interests. Could you talk a little bit about that and what sort of impact you see that having on businesses overall?
Oh boy, there's been lots of recent examples. So I think some of the most famous ones in the past year would be the Anheuser-Busch, the Targets, where those are retailers. So those are companies that we think about every day because many of us are deciding where to pick up goods, and we could go to Target. Maybe we're picking up beer for a party, and we could certainly choose the Anheuser items. And so what they did was broaden their focus to these other stakeholders who were really minor players, meanwhile upsetting the shareholders because the value of those companies plummeted, and then also obviously all the other stakeholders. The most recent one actually, and there's one every week, but the most recent one is the Norwegian company Stoka Baby, which last week suggested to parents that they shouldn't have any gender stereotypes for their babies. And they're a company that makes only baby gear for little baby boys and baby girls.
Now, how does those three letters we've been hearing more often, ESG, play into this whole debate?
Yeah, so what is ESG? And I would say that ESG came out of the CSR movement, which is corporate social responsibility, which came really as a reaction to Milton Friedman. So you got Milton Friedman, shareholder capitalism. Then you had this CSR push, which was really stakeholder capitalism. And there was already a push in that to start being more accountable for, for your impact. But then ESG measured that. And I think we all now know that it's about the environmental goals, like, for example, around climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, the social criteria such as how many of what types of surface level diversity you have in what levels of your firm. And then the governance is all about the leadership, executive pay, audits, internal controls, shareholder rights. But governance also extends to, for example, dictates around the composition of your board of directors based on surface level diversity.
And that seems like a lot of factors to kind of pack into one level of measurement. So how do they measure this overall?
So there are like 7 different major companies that do these ESG ratings. And first, I want to say that there has been no singular study nor any meta-analysis that pulls all this data together that shows that there's any relationship between being better at ESG and long-term shareholder performance. So no matter how you measure it, it doesn't add up. Now, there are correlations between certain factors, such as the more ESG you have, the less viewpoint diversity you have in your firm, which is kind of a scary thing, right? But we can imagine why there's at least a correlation there, maybe a causation. But so there's about 7 different ways to measure this, and you can, and the reason why they're measuring it is because this has been forced upon companies in Europe, and it's also being forced upon companies in the US too.
So on the social side, so the impact on society, does a higher ESG rating at least correlate with a better positive social impact?
You might hope so. There's all kinds of funny examples in this data of firms that have really high S or ES and G ratings, and then they're just like, frankly, terrible firms. So a famous example was Lukoil before the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Lukoil had really high ESG ratings because, by the way, they had done a few investments, and Exxon did the same thing, and it kind of greenwashes because when you're a firm that big and you do a little something, it looks like a lot. And there's lots of other examples. I mean, actually, at the end of the day, if you were to look at objective measures, it would be firms like Walmart that provide so many jobs, provide cost-effective, efficient goods all across America, that actually would have some of the highest ratings, even if that's not the case. Doesn't look like it online.
Well, can we talk more about Walmart? Because I think, wasn't there a study that was done on it that looked at its its impact on society, and also what sort of negative externalities exist, like what is its impact on the environment? Because I found that one personally surprising.
Yep. So this was an NBER paper, and it considered all the various stakeholders and the negative externalities, including the CO2. But the largest positive social impact came from Walmart because the business impacts affect so many people. Sells products at low prices to low-income consumers who wouldn't be able to get those elsewhere. And they'd find a lot of difficulty getting those. But that's not really captured in a lot of these ESG ratings. And that's important. I mean, maybe you don't think about Walmart every single day based on where you live, but if you live in most parts of America, that may be your closest mass retailer. And it's actually one that's still good to consumers. There's a separate case right now against Dollar General for having one price on the shelf and another at the till. And that would be the only other retailer that's penetrated so much of rural America, especially.
And with that Walmart example, that seems to be a good example of those value creation principles you were talking about in the beginning of this too. But moving away from just looking at it from the company policy and the company impact perspective, we're hearing about ESG a lot when it comes to the SEC, so many acronyms. So why are we all of a sudden hearing about it in relationship to the Security and Exchange Commission?
Thank you for asking that. It's funny because earlier today I wrote down when Leon Cooperman said this, he said, the market structure is being completely destroyed by the SEC. And here, the interesting thing is that the leftist changes that the Biden administration wants, they can't get through Congress and the Senate right now because of the elected officials. So instead, they're pushing through these rule changes in the agencies. So another one, briefly, is the FTC, which is basically going to ban all non-compete agreements across the country. We already have states like North Dakota and California that have banned them, and we know this is not good as far as a blanket-wide ban. But the SEC is taking this further. Now, the SEC has been around, set up like back in 1934, most of the basic rules, and it's been functioning pretty well. But what they're trying to do is push through all these new changes. And the big one that happened about 3 weeks ago was the Scope 1, Scope 2, or Scope 3 emissions for ESG. And then another big one that they have on the horizon is the human capital management disclosure.
And just for everyone's information, could you just briefly explain what you mean by Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3?
Yeah, sorry, it's a little confusing because you wouldn't think that these are pieces that companies would traditionally measure. But let me say that these are measured in Europe, and a lot of what we're seeing are things that Europe brought on even a decade or more ago. We can talk about quotas later, but the board gender quotas started coming in Norway 18 years ago. So they're now coming here. But basically, the SEC's, so what happens is the SEC says, hey, we're going to make some new rules. And they say, here are the new rules we're going to make. And these are going to happen sometime in the next 12 months, but we won't tell you exactly when. And over the last 12 months, they've had about 16 new rules. And then they gradually release what they think is the rule. They open it for public comment. And that's where academics like me, think tanks and others can put together research and say, whoa, guys, no, don't do this. And the most recent one was the Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So the original SEC proposal was that all public companies would need to report all 3 types of emissions. So Scope 1 is emissions from sources that the organization owns or controls directly, like burning fuel in a fleet of vehicles. That makes sense. We would know what that is. Scope 2 emissions are that the company causes indirectly and comes from the energy that it purchases and uses that's produced, for example, to generate the electricity in the buildings. that they use. And then scope 3 has nothing that's produced by the company and isn't the result of activities that are owned or controlled. But this is basically everything that's indirectly responsible for up and down the value chain. So you're guessing like how your consumers are going to use your products. And that I think most of us would agree that scope 3 was way out of scope. And fortunately, recently the SEC voted basically 3-2 on March 6th to only have scope 1 and scope 2 emissions.
Great.
And-
And I'm just doing a quick reminder to the people in the audience that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom meeting. So when we're done with this conversation, we'll start answering some questions there. So you don't have to wait until the Q&A time to start getting your questions in there. So feel free to do that. But given all of this, Siri, like, what are firms to do at this point? Because it seems like some of that is out of their control. They're being measured in ways that don't necessarily measure their actual impact on society. So what can firms do?
Great question. Well, first of all, I should have mentioned firms have got to respond really quickly. So this rule came on the books March 6th. There's publicly traded large companies are supposed to be compliant with the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions by 2026. And the cost of this, Hester Pierce, who's one of the SEC commissioners, estimated that across all these companies, it would cost $10 billion in compliance. And for fun, as I did a couple of nights ago, I watched YouTube videos of people who actually do this inside their firms, talking about it, and consultants trying to educate people. And it's a lot of bean counting that has absolutely no result. So what can firms do? Firms can push back. So certainly you can write briefs and comment letters when this comes out, but then you can also file lawsuits. And actually, just a few days ago, it's a company called Liberty Energy, and it's got a fracking company, Nomad, and they filed a petition to try to block this ruling and grant an administrative stay. And of course, organizations on the other side, like the Sierra Club, also filed an objection saying it didn't go far enough and shouldn't have scope 3 and gosh knows what else inside of it. So there can be some legal pushback. I think there's also just a need to be braver inside firms, and that's hard to say and to instill, but people need to stand up at all levels of the organization. Some other professors who collaborate a lot with IHS, Nikolai Foss and Peter Klein, published an article about this, about how many middle managers just bent over and broke and let some of the stuff go forward that ended up costing their firm hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars.
And it seems like it creates negative incentives for firms too. Like, for example, it seems like there's an incentive against listing publicly. Is that right?
This is the scary thing. And actually, we had another private equity person here the other day who smiled and said, yeah, but the worse the SEC is, the more firms like mine own it. So imagine the costs of doing this. And to small firms, they're really, really high to track all of this and do it in a way that is acceptable to the markets. So you would definitely see firms that were private staying private, because the cost of doing, unless you want some big exit and you want to say that you IPO'd your firm, the ease of doing business and the cost of doing business in terms of these parameters is going to be a lot better if you're privately held, because these rulings do not affect privately held firms. You could pull firms off the market. It will be interesting to see. That takes a lot of capital. But that is certainly possible, to see whether firms would try to do that. And of course, many firms are too big to do that.
Makes sense. So then what's your role as a professor in all of this? Like, what are you looking at? What is your center doing in response to this? And how does it tie into the overall debate?
Thanks for asking. This is the exciting part about being in a university and having so many different research areas. As faculty, and I helped to organize a consortium of management professors who meet once a month and discuss papers. And then I also help to run this doctoral training. And then we also have calls with some of the think tanks, but then also today we had former Senator Phil Gramm, and we were talking about these issues with our representatives, et cetera. We want to know, first of all, we as researchers, we don't want to just work on esoteric stuff just because the data happens to be there. So the most important thing is, what are the pressing issues? Where are the knowledge gaps? I don't have it behind me, but I have a whole pile of papers that are printed out that I've gone through, and I have drop boxes. So we know what's out there. And then we know, okay, what do we need to look at next? And there's a lot of big issues here. As I mentioned earlier, I'm pretty interested in this ESG to firm viewpoint diversity, because that also affects corporate political activity and donations. Lately, I've become really obsessed with pension funds. So imagine, and I knew them because I went to public schools, these teachers who teach all year, do extracurriculars, make a little bit of money. My biology teacher, who was also my track coach, then painted houses all summer. I just visited a local fire department with the CFO of Florida the other day, and those guys and the police are taking extra shifts to earn extra money, and those go in these state pension funds. Now imagine that these state pension funds are invested in ESG partly, and that leads to much lower returns. You've got firms like Silicon Valley Bank, which was all in on some pieces of this ESG and DEI and is now defunct. Can you imagine all these people working so hard all their lives and then having less savings because of the malfeasance of folks managing to this? And I should point out, we haven't talked about that. This happens because these shares that you and I and school teachers and firemen own are in mutual funds, but those sit within Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, and they vote your shares, not you. So they're the ones telling firms, oh, well, we need more. And by the way, they're the ones, those companies wrote the comment letters to the SEC saying we need scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 emissions because we're asking for them and we own all the shares. But actually, you and I own a lot of those shares, but we just don't vote those shares. You and I can only vote in proxies when we own the stock outright, not when it's inside of one of our mutual funds.
And when you have outside parties, policy groups, other types of people coming to ask you questions about this, like why? Like what questions is your research answering? What are you looking at with ESG?
So right now we got to take on the pension fund piece because this is an incredible amount of money. I was just talking with a former Florida State Rep, Adam Hasner, who works here, and he is also concerned with the debanking, because when firms get low enough ESG ratings, there's basically nothing to stop banks from debanking them. So that's kind of a fascinating area that we need to follow. We're also interested in, how basically how all of this affects folks. I see there's a few people on the call from Florida. If you've been following our Florida insurance prices, they've been going sky high. And that's because the reinsurers that are based, especially in Europe and New York, say that hurricanes are an ESG risk, and therefore the cost of capital should be higher, and therefore insurance premiums in some parts of Florida, depending on the buildings, et cetera, have gone up 50% in 1 year alone. And it's not that there are more hurricanes, there aren't really. It's because these are now ESG risks. So there's a lot of issues to unpack, and we're getting really organized around them. The data sets are a little bit expensive, so we try to collaborate as researchers across schools when we have access to them.
Great, thank you, Siri. And we're going to move into the Q&A portion now. So again, if you have a question, you could use the button at the bottom that says Q&A to submit it. And the first question we got builds on this. So what is the free market capitalism / free society, I'll add in / value creation answer to ESG? What would Milton Friedman say or do about this?
That's a great question. That's more than a $64,000 question. For me, I think we need to go. I mean, this stuff it shouldn't even, for me, most of this shouldn't even be part of the conversation. So I would shed it, because as soon as you measure it, you track it, and you get managers' attention, and we know that managers have limited attention. There are real things that we can measure. Actually, that was Phil Graham earlier today with his book talking about income inequality, but also I mean, we can talk about the very real things, right? How many people did firms employ? What salary? What did we contribute to those communities? You know, the real things, right? That we've, for example, I'm here at a public university in Florida. The tuition's only $5,500 a year. It's nothing, but we have a lot of local companies that will pay for any employee, whether it's the mechanic or the accountant, to get a business degree here. To me, that's value creation, and that's something that could be tracked. I just don't think we need this, and it's getting scarier because there's going to be more tracking. So we didn't get into the human capital disclosure rule, but they're talking about tracking the surface level diversity of every single person in the firm at every single level. So, and then also tracking like their promotions, and then, you know, who knows what's next? Are you going to get penalized for, you know, promoting based on merit versus on other characteristics?
That makes sense. And this next question actually has to do with something written by someone you and I were talking about earlier today, Hunter Hastings. So it's asking about his aberrant capitalism, the decay and revival of customer capitalism, Hunter Hastings and Stephen Denning. So in it, they discuss that shareholder capitalism could be a problem and not a positive, because it takes the focus off entrepreneurial function of corporations and their owners and away from their focus on consumers. Could you discuss what you think about that and how it plays into the overall discussion we're having today?
So for me, the great point for me, and I'm a strategy professor. So the first thing we teach in strategy is that there's got to be a customer, and you need to meet their needs. And that's the case for all of this. I mean, we certainly, shareholders are investing, but they're investing because there's a customer today and there'll be a customer tomorrow. Ideally, the same customer coming back, if that's a type, and then lots of new customers. So I think we need to keep an eye on the ball. I think the only issue with that, and this would go to that earlier question about free markets, is who is the customer? So I would shy away from the government being a major customer. So a free market perspective, you know, would not have really large roles of government. And by the way, that's also what this is, right? This is the government trying to tell corporations what to do. And that's a huge problem. And not even the elected government, the appointed government.
Right, our next question is, earlier you mentioned something about gender quota boards moving over from Europe. What did you mean by that?
Okay, so this has been my area of research for the last 22 years in my doctoral studies, and I've written about 20 papers on this. But basically, there's something called a board gender quota, and that is that a corporate board, or in some cases a state-owned company, those also exist, must have X% women. So the first one of those came in Norway, and then we've had like 15 of them since then. You may have heard about this in the States, because it did exist briefly in California until it was declared unconstitutional a year later. But this is the idea that on a board of however many people, so in Iceland, the boards are only 5 people, but as you know, in the States, publicly traded firm board could be 13 to 25 people. that there must be a certain share. In Iceland, it was 40% women. In the US, California wanted it to be at least one woman. And we also have NASDAQ pushing this for all firms that are NASDAQ listed. And your average NASDAQ listed firm has at least 5 board members. So these came from Europe. We call it a little bit of an avalanche. From Norway, it went to Spain, and then it went especially across like the Benelux countries and France. And I've done a ton of research with longitudinal data looking difference effects before and after the quota. There is no study that shows that these quotas lead to greater firm performance, whether you're comparing them to firms that didn't face a quota or you're comparing them to firms in the exact same industry with similar levels of sales in adjacent countries. So we compared Norway to Sweden, to Finland, to Denmark. And it's pretty scary stuff when the government tells you what the representation must be in your board. And what's suggested by the SEC, if they get through this human capital disclosure, is that they're going to tell you what the representation is going to have to be in your top management team, and your middle management team, in your new management trainees, maybe even in your interns.
Right, and just I'm asking this follow-up just from conversations we've had previously. So you said it doesn't like result in better performance. Does it result in a true diversity, at least in these boards?
Depends on the country. I just reviewed a paper this weekend based on Indian firms, and I had seen this too because I supervised a doctoral student, but it's also happened in France. You get familial appointments, and it happens in many, especially privately held. So you're not necessarily appointing the woman who on her own merits got into the top undergraduate institution, then got the top MBA, then worked in corporations for 10 or 15 years and got into the C-suite level and now gets a board appointment. No, you might just be appointing the sister, the daughter, the wife of a famous person, could be a politician, could be a CEO. So that's pretty scary. And that's what that paper also showed, that when you created these quotas, you got more of those types of women than you get these others. And then the other thing we've seen in the US is just the horrendous large number of political appointees. So you had so many people like Valerie Jarrett who were leaving the Obama administration and then taking positions on corporate boards. Sylvia Matthews Burwell, who ran Health and Human Services, now sits on 3 boards and that's pretty scary stuff, because they're basically, a lot of them are political appointees, a lot of them are family appointees, and it's not just in Europe and India, it's also in the US, at least for those political appointees.
And then next question says, they agree with you, these policies are not good, but what's going to happen next? Like, could you give us an uplifting note to end on? What are paths forward, potential future outcomes, and ways of increasing like the value creation of corporations versus using these measurements that you're saying are not having even their intended outcome?
So, well, that's, why IHS is so inspiring for us, because for me, IHS is like the backbone that connects us. Like, I would never have met so many great law professors and philosophy and history professors who've informed my work. And the same thing, to go forward, we just need to work together. So yesterday, Mark Wheat was writing an amicus brief to push back on the NASDAQ ruling, and I was sending him papers and quotes to put in that. Today, I was talking to someone about a firm that's really upset about these rules and trying to connect them to a law firm in DC that will do the pro bono work to protest on their behalf. We, as researchers, Jean, you and I just had that conversation at 8 a.m. this morning, like we've got to work on the key issues here. Sometimes it's easy to do like convenience research because you know what the data set is and you can, and that's great, but then we actually need to answer these questions like, how is ESG destroying pensions? And then work really well together to do that. And that's another great example from IHS, right? Not only creating these communities, but also working positively and collaboratively, and not like a single actor or organization or academic or professional taking credit for that, but just like, this is a team effort. Let's come together. Let's run it down. And also we need to train up new academics to think about these areas and work on them.
Let me reframe what you were saying back to you, but in a way that kind of links together, especially like what the professor role is in this. And let me know if I stating this incorrectly. It sounds to me that the value that you as a professor brings to these conversations is you're doing research that measures the actual impact of what's going on. And it's hard to disagree with data that shows this is how these policies result in something that hurts the output of these companies, but also doesn't achieve the stated goals of the policies there. And you're seen as an unbiased source since you're running the actual data and looking at what's going on. So even though your message sounds like one of just, doom and gloom, the positive of that is this is actual measured data, right? That can be used when people make decisions in the future. So if people want to make decisions that are in a more value creating way, which they ought to be, they can look at the impact of the policies and what sort of measures need to change in order to reverse that. Is that a correct restatement of what you were saying?
Thank you. Yes. And I am positive about it, especially in certain areas. Another thing we can do is go through existing research and pick apart the stuff. So I published one paper where basically everyone said, oh, more diversity on boards, better firm performance. And I published that paper in a good journal, and it said, no, look, all of these papers had all these statistical errors in them. Here they are. Now here's a paper that doesn't have any of those statistical errors, and look what we find. And then with the non-compete agreements, which is super scary, because if you run a firm, why would you invest in your human capital if they could just walk out the door tomorrow? And what we did there is we did a meta-analysis of and a literature review of everything that's out there, and said, look, before you ban non-competes entirely, let's deep dive into this literature and let's see the effects of this. And the fortunate thing about comment letters to the SEC, there is no limit on those. The good news is that we're thanks to IHS and others, we're in touch now with lawyers who can, and the other pieces of the puzzle, because that's the one thing I would say. We're not in an age where a single person can change this. We have got to work together on solutions.
Great, thank you so much. This is Dr. Siri Terjesen. It was a pleasure having you here. And as you know, I always love it when we get the chance to chat. So I'm glad you joined us today. For everybody, as Lindsay mentioned at the beginning of the call, today was the second of an ongoing series on virtual conversations just like this one. I'm very excited about the next one, and we're excited to invite you to it on May 9th, where we'll be delving into regulatory reform, occupational licensing, and other issues affecting your access to things like health or the ability of a new hospital to open up. We'll be joined by Alicia Plemons, assistant professor at West Virginia University. She's going to lead the conversation and talk about things like how her research was actually used to save lives in some cases, because it opened up medical care and treatment to people who didn't have access due to regulatory or barriers that existed, and not due to a lack of resources in the area. So she'll talk through how undoing some of those barriers have increased prosperity, access to preventative care, and increased entrepreneurship in the states where it happens. So again, that's going to be on May 9th, and I'm very excited about it. We hope you'll join. The invitations for that will be coming soon. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you for those great questions. And thank you so much, Siri, for joining us for this.